6 days into the US-Israeli attack on Iran, Iran has retaliated with more missiles and drones aimed at Israel and at US bases in neighbouring Gulf states. Qatar's defence ministry says it's working to intercept the missiles, but columns of black smoke could be seen in the skies above the capital, Doha. Israel also confirmed multiple incoming attacks. Emergency services examined the scene of a projectile impact near Tel Aviv. The IDF has begun a large-scale wave of strikes against Iranian infrastructure. Iranian news media have reported explosions in Tehran. Iran's Veterans Foundation says the death toll from US and Israeli attacks has risen to 1,230. Meanwhile, Britain is sending additional fighter jets to Qatar. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the 4 Typhoon aircraft will join a squadron already in the Gulf state to help defend against Iranian missiles and drones. On Monday, an Iranian drone struck the Royal Air Force base on Arkrotiri on Cyprus. Jasmine El-Gamal is a Middle East policy analyst and the founder and CEO of Avros Strategies. She previously served as Middle East advisor to the Pentagon. Welcome to DW. Nearly a week in, what's your assessment of where things in this war stand?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, as we've seen over the last few days, the president and his team have had a really hard time justifying to the American public, to Congress, to allies, what exactly their reasoning was for going to war with Iran at this time, and what its objectives are, clearly stated, achievable objectives, as well as what the exit plan is. In classified briefings to Congress, senators who have been in those briefings have said that they are very worried after getting those classified briefings, and they did not answer any of those questions. And in the meantime, as you've stated in your introduction, the damage is escalating rapidly. Everything from strikes against allies, 6 US troops killed, and over 1,000 Iranians killed, other civilians killed in the region, and tens of thousands displaced so far within Iran, within Lebanon, and of course, people stranded in the Gulf trying to get home. So it appears that the U.S. is poised to escalate further, that it does not have a clearly defined victory point where it can say we've done what we want to do and we're now going to go home. And that leaves a lot more risk of uncontrolled escalation, I fear, over the next several days and weeks.
This is a joint US-Israeli war. Do they both want the same thing?
That's a really good question. Thank you for clarifying that. They don't want exactly the same thing. The Israeli Prime Minister's objective is crystal clear and has been for decades, which is regime change in Iran. This has been the case ever since I worked at the Pentagon back in 2008. We know from extensive reporting, New York Times, otherwise, briefings from senators, that he has been trying to convince the US president for months to strike the Iranian regime while it was down and weak. When it comes to US objectives, that is less clear. As you've seen, the president and his team have been retroactively trying to come up with a list of objectives to justify the war. President Trump started in the beginning by saying this was a regime change operation, essentially calling on the Iranian people to rise up and take advantage of the opportunity. And now the objectives have changed to, I would describe it as a weakening of the regime, not necessarily regime change, but just a pliant regime that is demilitarized and that does not pose a threat to the United States or its allies in the region.
Let's take a look at some of today's developments. And how much credence do you give to reports emerging, which have been denied by the White House, that the CIA has been talking to Kurdish forces in northern Iraq about arming them so they can take on the regime in Tehran?
These are some really murky reports that we're seeing. We have not actually seen any confirmation, credible confirmation of that. This was first reported in the Israeli press and then picked up by other outlets. There have been denials from various individuals and the Iraqi government and the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, have stepped in, making it very clear that they have no interest in being dragged into this war and inviting Iranian retaliation on Iraqi soil. So I would take those reports with a grain of salt until we know much more about the situation.
Mind you, I suppose without sort of launching into conspiracy theories, they would say that, wouldn't they? They would say that we're not going to, that this is a secret operation, which we completely deny. This is what you would expect them to say.
I think that there are a lot of actors at the moment who have an interest in leaking stories to the press to create an impression that may not be entirely accurate on the ground. There's a lot of disinformation so far going around in this war. And as you know, information warfare is just as critical in times of war as kinetic action. And so I just would caution not believing everything you read until we have a better understanding of the situation. Obviously, it goes without saying that if that is the case, it would be disastrous and add just another element and layer of risk into the situation, attacking Iranian unity and fomenting civil unrest inside of Iran. But again, I would just wait until we have some more clarity on that.
You've advised the Pentagon. Help us understand this apparent chaos. We've seen 2 Gulf wars and Gaza and now this Iran business, and it's become evident that little, if any, thought has been given to what happens when the bombing stops. How does that happen?
That's a really good question. So first off, I was a civil servant for almost 8 years at the Pentagon, inside the Pentagon. I was not an outside advisor to the Pentagon. And so I worked during the Obama administration, during some very tumultuous times, the Arab Spring, counter-ISIS campaigns, the Syrian civil war, and so on. And, you know, it's very easy to see how political leadership without the proper checks and balances and with the right domestic political environment can take the country to war if those checks and balances are not properly exercised. The president is not running for another term. He cares less about what the American people think. He has allies in Congress in the Republican Party who are protecting him. You just saw the War Powers Resolution being failing yesterday in Congress because of not enough Republicans who are willing to vote against the president. And so you don't see that system of checks and balances being exercised carefully. You also have an international context where we've really seen the laws of armed conflict, international law being frayed at the seams. Over the last couple of years, we've seen the war in Gaza violate nearly every international norm and law that we have seen in decades, and very little done about it by the purported defenders of international law, including in Europe. And so it's not hard to see that that is a precedent and a slow boil that has resulted in where we are now, again, with the huge push by the Israeli Prime Minister to fulfill his objective of decades.
Let's talk about where this is likely to end up, because it's clear that, as you say, Israel wants a weakened Iran. Israel would benefit by having a weakened Iran on its doorstep. But without this proper exit plan, the one thing that everyone seems to agree on is that even if the mullahs are removed, chaos will probably ensue and civil war for a protracted period before anything like democracy emerges. Is that how you see it?
So that's one of the scenarios. I mean, obviously, in situations like this, it's difficult to predict, but there are several scenarios. One is just a continued war of attrition where the Iranian regime, we're not just talking about the mullahs and clerics, right? We're talking about the IRGC, which is very, very hard line. We're talking about internally the Basij paramilitary forces that are armed, and we're talking about proxies across the region that have already started to be activated by Iran. You're seeing happening in Lebanon right now with a very aggressive Israeli retaliation on Lebanon and scenes of chaos, absolute chaos coming out of Lebanon the last couple of days. And so one scenario is just you see more of that being drawn out and Iran raising the cost of this war more and more on the US, Israel, and its allies, the Gulf countries, for example. If that happens, you start to see a scenario where you have global trade disrupted, oil prices increasing, and more opportunities for miscalculation and continued armed conflict, violent conflict. The other scenario is that you could have a supreme leader be appointed that was even more hardline than the one before, and you have continued Iranian aggression and conflict. There are very few positive scenarios. I won't
Right.
take up too much of your
Okay.
time laying out the worst case scenarios, but you get the drift.
I do, and it's very clear, and I thank you for that, Jasmine. Jasmine El-Gamal from Avros Strategies.
Thanks for having me.